presidents. Evan Phillips is on your screen right now. And as I told you earlier, is the author of numerous books. His latest is called American Dynasty, Aristocracy, Fortune, and the Politics of Deceit in the House of Bush. What is your thesis in this book?
My thesis is that we have had 4 generations of the Bush family in the United States. 2 of them, the most recent 2, were presidents. The previous one was a U.S. senator who wanted to be president, and the 2 great-grandfathers of the current president before that were the ones who made the money. And this dynasty is unique in the sense not only of the mere 8 years between the 2 presidents, who had almost the same name, they look a lot alike, they have the same interest groups, the same donors, a lot of the same voters. And the 4 generations go back, and you find a family that has been involved in finance, in oil, in the early years, in the middle years, in the current years of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and with a thread running through it all of closeness to the intelligence community. And as a result, you have a kind of unique pattern of how they have ascended to power, and also, I think, a very unique set of commitments and grudges and financial interrelationships with people in parts of the world that have posed some real problems for the United States as we get sucked in further and further to the Middle East.
How does this family history differ from other political dynasties such as the Kennedys?
Well, the Kennedys had just 1 president. They haven't yet had 2. I doubt that they will. The Adamses had 2, but they were in different parties and 24 years apart, so there's hardly any continuity. The Roosevelts had 2, but they were only cousins in different parties and 20 years apart. So this whole pattern is much more interrelated than the previous ones. And I think on every dimension, from Enron and Halliburton and energy to Saudi Arabia and bin Laden ties and Iraq, you really have a continuity of interest groups, relationships, tactics, and grudges between the 41st president and the 43rd.
Now, as you mentioned that list, it sounds a lot like many of the callers that we have on the program who have been following some of these stories. And you mentioned, Mr. Phillips, in your introduction that it's important in your mind to distinguish between the conspiracy theorists and genuine research into this. Would you pick up on that thought?
Well, obviously, conspiracy, all you have to do, say, for example, is punch in George Bush and Hitler on the internet, and you'll get about 12,000 citations, most of which are totally off the wall. Conspiracy theorists are all over the place in American politics. But the difference between investigation and conspiracy in terms of dynasties is really very simple. Europe and the history of a lot of the monarchies over there, I mean, everybody knows the dynasties. In Britain, the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, currently the House of Windsor. They all involve elements of conspiracy and plotting and planning and favoritism to get where they were, because that's part of how it works historically. If you're going to keep a family in power, not everything is above the surface. It's more like an iceberg where 10% is above the surface and 90% has been going on for a while, but people don't know about it. That's not conspiracy theory. That's proven history, the way dynasties work.
Well, speaking of the houses of Europe, you do say that what you see is happening in the United States with dynastic policy is a trend that is happening globally in the Far East, in Europe, and as well. Would you talk more about that?
Well, I wish it wasn't happening, but it is. You can see that from Italy to Eastern Europe, there's some growing demand generally from people in conservative politics to bring back some of the monarchies that were thrown out of different countries at the end of World War II, generally for some degree or other of fascist connection. This has been the case in Italy, Romania, Bulgaria has a prime minister who was also a claimant to the throne. The Bush administration, which is no stranger to some of these thought processes, has actually had at different points the idea of restoring the monarchy in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So it's been mentioned in both countries. I find this extraordinary. The period, really the 50 years after the end of World War II, saw the end of a lot of monarchies. And what we've seen in the last 5 years, but the seeds go back well into the late 80s and 90s, is the restoration of monarchies. And to me, the parallel between the restoration of the Bushes in 2000 and the restoration of some of the royal families after they'd been overthrown and then kicked out of Paris and London, and then they come back 10 or 15 years later, it was called a restoration. I mean, the Restoration comedies in Stuart, England. A lot of the same sort of thing happened in 2000. The most conservative part of the country was leading the Restoration, the South, and you had a major element of support from the religious leaders who are almost always part of a conservative restoration. To me, this whole set of parallels is a fascinating one, but Americans aren't all that big on that kind of history, so it's kind of hard to market it.
You're right that what's at the stage for this, it was the reaction, first of all, to losing the first Bush White House, and then seeing especially the moral problems that might have erupted during the Clinton administration, a real desire by Republican partisans to restore power. Now, might the stage be set for the same thing in 2004 as a result of Florida and the anger the Democrats have about the situation there?
Well, I suppose it might. One of the things I get into in the book is the notion of the October surprise back in 1980 when some of the Democrats claimed that the Republicans in the Reagan-Bush campaign were plotting with the revolutionary government of Iran to keep the hostages and not let them be released before the election, which would have helped Jimmy Carter. So if you take that, which there's some more circumstantial evidence for this that's come out in the last 10 years, if you put that together with 2000, you can figure out how Democrats could be steaming and think they wanted a restoration. But if they don't get it in 2004, they might have a different restoration in 2008. They can restore the House of Clinton because there's some sense that Hillary would like to be a candidate. So I think this is percolating in the American system and not the greatest thing around.
There you have a bit of Kevin Phillips' 330-page thesis that is in American Dynasty. It is also fully annotated in the back, all of his references and research for the book. But we'd like to have you involved in the conversation, so let's get to some of your telephone calls. We're going to begin with a call from Concord, Massachusetts for Kevin Phillips. Oh, we lost Concord. Let's move on to Lakewood, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I wanted to ask the gentleman here a couple of questions. I've been kind of paying attention the last 20 years or so. I'm not really a Democrat or Republican, but I notice I see a lot of things to do with the media, and all this concentration and saturation of the media and how they run wild with these subjects like, the sodomy laws in Texas, when meanwhile the vice president's sitting on the nation's energy policy, and we're paying $2 a gallon for gas, and then I hear they're wanting to make Reagan put him on Mount Rushmore, and he raised taxes about 3 times, and they said he gave this big tax cut, and he raised everybody's payroll taxes, and the same kind of thing is going on now 20 years later, but it's just like it's so venomous now, and it's so divided, so much hatred going on. I'd just like to know what do you think the connection is with the media and the energy industry and the big money, and is there a line there between all this?
Well, I've been a skeptic of the media's role in politics for a long time, going back to the period when I was active in Republican politics. I wrote a book that came out in 1969 called The Emerging Republican Majority, and I was very conscious at the time, and I think this was true pretty much through the 70s, that the media took the liberal side and didn't want to see the change that was bringing the Republicans to power, and were very aggressive during the Watergate period and so forth. Now, I think kind of the reverse has been apparent in the last 3 or 4 years. Maybe it's just 9/11. Maybe they think it's a patriotic duty to go along with what the White House says or what the Department of Defense says. But I think there has been a real weakness in the coverage of what's going on in this country by the media. And in my book touring and different call-ins and so forth, I've just been struck by how many Americans don't think they get the truth from the media anymore. And I have some of the same sense that there's just an apology for the status quo, and that reminds me of what I thought was there in the late 60s when they were apologizing for a liberal status quo.
Manassas, Virginia. Good morning.
Oh, yeah, thank you. A question on to Mr. Phillips there. I know you just mentioned that you used to be involved in, more conservative Republican politics. And I was just curious whether this book is more about, your rejection of conservative politics or Republican politics, because I've listened to you on Pacifica Radio and those types of things, which is a ultra left-wing radio. They're hawking your book for their fundraising. And I'm wondering whether this is more of a concern for real reporting, or whether it's primarily a result of your shift to what I would call almost radical left-wing politics.
Well, I'm not sure I want to agree with the notion of shifting to radical left-wing politics. I get into some of my motivations